Picture this. You're at a dinner party. Someone mentions they just put a down payment on a second property. Someone else is talking about their Tesla, the new one, not last year's. A guy across the table just got back from 2 weeks in Japan, business class both ways. And you're sitting there thinking, what am I missing? You make decent money, you're not reckless, you don't buy things you can't afford, at least you try not to, but somehow everyone around you seems to be operating in a completely different financial reality, like they received a memo you never got. Here's the thing, they kind of did. Not a literal memo, but there is a system, a set of invisible financial mechanics that creates the illusion that everyone around you is doing better than you, and it's specifically designed to make you feel that way. Not out of malice, just out of the cold, grinding logic of how money, credit, and social signaling have fused together into something most people never fully examine. This video is about that system, what it is, how it works, and why understanding it might be the most financially important thing you do this year. Let's start with a number. The median American household income is around $74,000 a year. That's the middle. Half the country makes more, half makes less. Now, the median American household also carries about $137,000 in non-mortgage debt. That's car loans, student loans, credit cards. Combine that with the median home mortgage of roughly $200,000, and you're looking at most middle-class households sitting on somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 in total debt. And yet, and this is the part worth sitting with, the country just hit a record for luxury SUV sales. Airline revenue is at an all-time high. Restaurant spending hasn't slowed in 3 years. So what's actually going on? Are people secretly wealthier than the statistics suggest? Or is something else happening? Something that makes average people appear far more affluent than they actually are? The answer is yes, but it's complicated. To understand this, you need to understand how the modern economy treats consumption. Specifically, you need to understand a shift that happened quietly over about 40 years, starting in the early 1980s. Before then, credit was harder to get. Not impossible, but you needed a relationship with a bank, a real income history, and often some kind of collateral. A credit card wasn't something you got in the mail, it was something you applied for, sat across a desk for, and sometimes got rejected from. Then deregulation happened. Interest rate caps came off, credit card companies exploded, and then the crucial piece, credit scoring became standardized and automated. By the mid-90s, a computer could approve you for a $10,000 credit line in minutes. By the 2000s, banks were competing to give you money you hadn't asked for. Here's why that matters. When credit was scarce, consumption was a pretty accurate signal of wealth. If someone drove a nice car, they probably had money. If someone went on expensive vacations, they probably had money. The display of wealth was more or less tied to actual wealth. When credit became nearly universal, that signal broke. Now anyone can consume like a wealthy person. You just do it with debt instead of money. And this right here is the foundation of the illusion. Let me show you how this plays out in real numbers. Take two people. Call them Marcus and Daniel. Marcus earns $95,000 a year. He has a $480,000 mortgage, a $42,000 car loan, and about $18,000 in credit card debt. His monthly payments eat roughly 45% of his take-home pay. But on paper, or rather on Instagram, Marcus looks like he's winning. New car in the driveway, beautiful house, family vacation photos every summer. Daniel earns $85,000 a year. He has a $260,000 mortgage, no car loan, and $4,000 in savings. He drives a 7-year-old Honda. He doesn't post much on social media. Who's actually ahead? Daniel, by a significant margin. His net worth is growing. His risk exposure is low. One job loss or medical event won't unravel his entire financial structure. But at a dinner party, nobody's looking at Daniel's balance sheet. They're looking at Marcus's driveway. The point isn't that Marcus is stupid. The point is that the system made it incredibly easy for Marcus to look wealthy without being wealthy. And that's not an accident. Here's where it gets more interesting. The financial industry doesn't just enable the solution, it profits from it in a very specific way. And once you see this mechanism, you start to understand why it's so durable. Banks make money on the spread, the difference between what they pay for money and what they charge for it. When you put $10,000 in a savings account at 0.5% interest and they lend it out on a credit card at 24% interest, the spread is the entire business. But here's the subtler part. The more consumption is driven by credit, the more of the economy runs on that spread. Consumer spending is about 70% of American GDP. A meaningful chunk of that consumer spending isn't backed by income, it's backed by debt. Which means a meaningful chunk of the entire economy depends on people spending money they don't technically have. This creates a kind of structural incentive to keep people spending, not by forcing them, but by making the infrastructure of debt so seamless, so normalized, so deeply embedded in every purchase moment that borrowing feels less like a financial decision and more like just the way things work. Buy now, pay later. 0% financing for 18 months. No money down. You deserve it. You've earned it. Language designed to remove friction, to make debt feel like a feature rather than a cost. And then there's social media, which took this illusion and gave it a rocket engine. Before social platforms, the comparison pool was relatively small. Your neighborhood, your office, your family. You could only feel behind relative to the people you actually knew, which was maybe a few hundred people at most. Now the comparison pool is infinite. You're not just comparing yourself to your neighbors, you're comparing yourself to the most curated, edited, filtered, highlight reel version of every person you've ever met, plus millions of strangers whose entire online presence is optimized to project success. The research on this is stark. A 2018 study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found a statistically significant link between exposure to social media posts about peer consumption and increases in personal debt. When people saw their social network consuming at higher levels, they borrowed more to keep up, often without consciously registering what was driving the decision. Let that sit for a second. The algorithm isn't just showing you what your friends are doing, it's quietly reshaping what you think you should be doing, and by extension, what you think you should be spending, and by extension, how much you should be willing to borrow. It's a sophisticated machine for manufacturing inadequacy. And nobody built it to be malicious, it just evolved that way, because inadequacy is extremely good for business. Now let's talk about the part most financial content skips over, because it's uncomfortable. A significant portion of the wealth you see displayed around you isn't wealth at all. It's a forward bet. It's someone living at a lifestyle level they expect to maintain or improve based on future income or asset appreciation that hasn't happened yet. The guy with the $900,000 house in a market that's been rising for 10 years, he feels wealthy. His house says he's wealthy, but that wealth is entirely contingent on the market not correcting, on him keeping his job, on interest rates not rising past the point where buyers disappear. The woman with the $80,000 car on a 7-year loan, she's paying about $1,100 a month. If that car depreciates at normal rates, and it will, she'll be underwater on the loan within 2 years, meaning she'll owe more than the car is worth. That's called being upside down. And according to Edmunds, about 25% of car trade-ins in the US are upside down. 1 in 4 people trading in a car owes more than it's worth. This is the quiet math underneath the glossy surface. Wealth displayed is not always wealth owned. Sometimes it's wealth borrowed against the assumption that everything will keep going up. And for a long time, that assumption held up surprisingly well. From 2010 to 2020, the US stock market roughly quadrupled. Home prices in most major metros doubled or tripled. Crypto created a new class of paper millionaires almost overnight. If you owned assets during that period, almost any assets, you felt richer than you were, and you spent accordingly. The 2021-2022 era was a particular fever dream. Zero interest rates meant borrowing was essentially free, Asset prices kept climbing, stimulus checks dropped into bank accounts, and consumer spending hit levels that made economists genuinely scratch their heads. People were buying boats, not metaphorically. Actual boat sales hit their highest point in 13 years. The hangover, predictably, arrived. By 2023 and into 2024, consumer credit card debt in the U.S. crossed $1.1 trillion for the first time in history. Delinquency rates started rising. Buy now, pay later default rates quietly began climbing. The saving rate dropped to levels not seen since before the 2008 financial crisis. The party looked incredible from the outside. From the inside, the credit card bills were starting to pile up. Here's the uncomfortable truth that ties all of this together. You are not comparing yourself to people's reality. You're comparing yourself to their presentation. And their presentation is partly funded by debt, partly amplified by social media, and partly propped up by asset prices that may or may not hold. When you feel behind, what you're actually feeling is the gap between your honest financial position and someone else's curated financial image. And that gap is by design almost impossible to close, because the image is always a step ahead of the reality. This is not an excuse to stop trying. This is not a reason to feel smug about the guy with the nice car. This is just the mechanism, laid bare so you can see it for what it is. Because here's what's interesting. People who actually accumulate wealth, not perform it but genuinely build it, tend to share a specific characteristic that looks almost indistinguishable from falling behind. They look ordinary, on purpose. There's a term for this, the millionaire next door, popularized by a book of the same name from the late 1990s, which studied actual high net worth individuals and found something that shocked a lot of people at the time. Most of them didn't look rich. They drove used cars, lived in modest houses, didn't wear luxury brands. The stereotype of the ostentatious wealthy person, the one who makes sure you know they're doing well, turned out to be, in aggregate, less wealthy than the quiet accumulator who reinvested instead of displayed. The research found that a disproportionate number of wealthy people lived in neighborhoods where their income was above average, not to show off, but because it reduced the pressure to match a peer group's consumption. When everyone around you is driving a $70,000 car, it becomes very hard to drive your $14,000 Honda without feeling a constant low-grade social anxiety. Lifestyle inflation is not just a personal failing, it's a rational response to social pressure, which makes it significantly harder to resist than most financial advice acknowledges. So why does any of this matter right now, specifically? Because the stakes are genuinely higher than they've been in a generation. Interest rates rose faster between 2022 and 2023 than at any point since the early 1980s. The cost of carrying debt, any debt, is no longer negligible. A $10,000 credit card balance at 24% interest costs you $2,400 a year just to stand still. That's not paying it down, that's just the fee for having it. Meanwhile, the assets that made people feel wealthy, houses, stocks, crypto, have all shown that they can and do fall. The people who borrowed against those assets or spent as though that paper wealth was real income are finding out that the math was always there, it just wasn't visible when everything was going up. The comparison trap doesn't just make you feel bad. In a high-rate environment, it can push people into genuinely destructive financial decisions. Taking on debt to maintain a lifestyle, staying in a house they can't afford because selling feels like admitting defeat, avoiding the honest accounting because the honest accounting is terrifying. Here's the thing nobody tells you about money, though, and I mean this with no sentimentality. The feeling of being behind is almost universal. It cuts across income levels. Studies consistently show that people across nearly every income bracket feel like they're not quite keeping up, that the threshold for feeling financially secure is always just a little bit ahead of wherever they currently are. This isn't a coincidence. It's a feature of a system where the definition of enough is constantly recalibrated upward by everyone around you spending more, often on credit they can't really sustain. The person you think is ahead of you is comparing themselves to someone they think is ahead of them. The guy with the Tesla is looking at the guy with the Porsche. The guy with the Porsche is looking at the guy with the second house. The guy with the second house is looking at the guy with the investment portfolio he never talks about. And the guy with the investment portfolio is quietly wondering why he doesn't have a yacht. The ladder doesn't end. The comparison doesn't end. The feeling of behindness doesn't end unless you make a deliberate decision to step off the escalator and look at your actual numbers in your actual life against your actual goals. Not someone else's goals, yours. That's the shift. And it sounds simple. And it is simple. Simple is not the same as easy. In a system this comprehensively designed to make you feel inadequate, staying anchored to your own financial reality requires more active resistance than most people realize. It means looking at your net worth, not your lifestyle. Net worth is assets minus liabilities. Everything you own minus everything you owe. That number is your actual financial position, not your car, not your house, not your vacation photos. It means understanding the difference between someone who has money and someone who appears to have money. The two are not the same. They overlap sometimes, but the overlap is smaller than social media would have you believe. And it means accepting, genuinely accepting, not just intellectually nodding at, the idea that building real financial security is quiet, slow, and deeply unsexy. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't make for interesting dinner conversation. It looks, from the outside, a lot like falling behind. But here's where I want to leave you. And I don't have a clean bow to tie on this. The system we've described is not going away. Credit will stay easy to access. Social media will keep showing you the best version of everyone else's financial life. The pressure to consume, to upgrade, to keep up will remain structurally embedded in how the economy actually functions. And the uncomfortable question, the one worth sitting with after this video, isn't whether the system is fair. It isn't whether you're making good decisions. It isn't even whether the people around you are financially stable as they look. The question is this: if everyone around you is measuring success by metrics that are at least partly illusory, debt-funded lifestyles, paper wealth in volatile assets, social displays optimized for perception, what does it actually mean to win? What does being ahead actually look like when you strip away everything borrowed, everything inflated, everything curated for an audience? I don't know your answer to that. But I'd argue that not knowing it, not having a clear, personal, concrete answer to that question is more expensive than any bad financial decision you've ever made. Because without it, you're just running a race where the finish line keeps moving, and everyone looks like they're ahead of you.